Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to MIDI remote in Cubase. MIDI remote is the process of configuring graphical interfaces called surfaces to hardware. Here you can see a couple of surfaces that I have partially constructed. We're going to add some controls to my Native Instruments Complete keyboard today. And the real value of MIDI remote is that it allows us to map controls on the keyboard into functions in Cubase. So we can basically operate Cubase from our hardware. Hope you enjoy this video today. Check out the Patreon and channel member links below. If you do, it's an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Okay, let's make a start. So it's a three-stage process to configuring a MIDI remote surface. The first thing is to add the surface itself. If you head into the MIDI remote tab in the lower editor, you're going to see this plus button. Now I've already configured the hardware and it's a little bit difficult for me, unless I delete these surfaces, for me to show you this stuff, but it's incredibly simple. If you click the plus button, you get a really obvious pick list of choices. So you select the manufacturer of your instrument. If I hadn't already configured those surfaces, I would basically be able to pick, is this the Native Instruments Complete or the machine? Select your input and output ports. All of this is so straightforward. I am jumping over it. It's, like I say, difficult for me to show you, but very, very straightforward. The really interesting stuff starts in stage 2 once you've created your surface, because this is where we start adding controls to that surface. If you hover over it, the little pencil at the bottom allows us to edit it. You're going to press that button, and this is where we're going to start today. I'm going to add 3 buttons and 3 knobs to the top left-hand corner of this surface. I've deleted them so that I can recreate them today. And just for some context, I'll put up a screenshot of the controls that I'm going to map to. I don't have 2 cameras, so I can't do this live. Basically, I have a row of 8 buttons and 8 knobs, which have a page 1 and a page 2 state. So these controls up here are page 1, and the lower controls are page 2. I'm also going to show you at this stage my keyboard editor. So this is the Complete Control Management application. And we're starting with buttons today, so we're having a look. Here's page 1 and page 2, as you can see. So they're basically 2 physical buttons on the keyboard that I press to toggle between these 2 states. And we're starting with button number 1, which is configured to output MIDI CC 100. And it's a toggle state, which means it basically oscillates or toggles between sending 0s and 127s to Cubase. That's really important. We'll see that shortly. So that's what my physical keyboard's doing. Now let's create a button that we can map to it. If I click anywhere in this grid, you're going to get this red focus zone. And these grids, basically, they start completely empty. They can be resized as big or small as you want. And when you click anywhere in the grid, you get this red focus zone. That's the size of the control that's just about to be added to the surface. Now I'm creating some of these buttons. So I'm going to pick up the control zone, the focus zone, and make it that big. I need to tell Cubase that I'm about to create a button. So that's the pick list down the left-hand side. And with those 2 things done, we're ready to go. Now you can add these controls manually to the surface, but the easiest thing is to actually just press the physical button on your keyboard. The focus zone immediately skips to the next obvious zone that Cubase thinks you're going to want to add a control, and indeed I do. I want to create button number 2, and here's button number 3. That's then created. While we're at it, let's create the knobs. If I click in the top left-hand corner of the area I want this focus rectangle to appear and resize it to the size that I want, I'm going to create a knob, and now I'll move the physical control on my keyboard. There's knob 1, number 2, and 3. So as you can see, very, very fast to get the controls added to the surface. Now we need to tell them what to do. Let's go back to button number 1. In the properties window on the right-hand side, we've got some very important configuration information. We need to make sure this is talking the same language as our physical controller. We need to get these 2 things communicating properly with each other. Well, my button is a toggle control. That means that the keyboard itself is actually responsible for maintaining its own state. And as you'll see later, that's something that's very important for us to be able to understand. Now, as far as buttons are concerned, the default button properties are completely fine. You can leave all of these exactly as is. There are conversations to be had about some of these controls. We're going to need to understand what they do. But just for now, I'm kind of trying to get to the stage where we're actually doing something practical and we don't need to edit any of these properties, so let's not worry about it just for now. So that's stage 2, the addition of the control to our surface. Stage 3 is the process of connecting this button into Cubase. We want to make it do something now. We do that with the mapping assistant. There are 2 ways you can get to it. There's the button at the bottom, go to mapping assistant, but more often than not, I just press this little button up here. Don't know why, that's the one I pick. They both do the same job. This is the mapping assistant. The first thing that you want to do is open your functions browser. That's really important, we're going to need it. And the second thing is to make it a bit bigger, because the representation, the graphical representation of your surface scales. So let's make it nice and big and we can see what we're doing. So in the mapping assistant, we have the keyboard controller on the left-hand side. You simply click the control that you're interested in mapping. That's part 1 of the job done. Then we need to map it into a specific function. For button number 1, I've decided to map it to the solo function. So in your browser, type what you're searching for, and Cubase will auto-select every function that contains the word solo. Selected track solo is actually the function I want. There are 2 different ways that we can map this into the control. You can do it with a single click. Simply click on that control and you can see the right-hand side of this mapping pair has now been populated. And then we click Apply Mapping. I'll do the other 2 buttons and then we'll come back and look at this in a little bit more detail. The second button I'm going to map to mute, but this time I'm going to double click where it says mute. And it simply jumps over the need to press the apply button, the apply mapping button. And the third function, I want to select record enable, and I'll do this one manually. This time I selected the browser option first. It doesn't matter at all. Now I can select the button and I have both sides of the pair, so I can click apply mapping. One of the benefits of setting up these surfaces is that the controls themselves tell you what they do. You can see there's the record enable symbol that's been populated into that button. Okay, so far so good. Let's go back to button number 1. Here's the solo function. Now you might think that we've done everything that we needed to do, but we haven't. This isn't going to work yet. Let me just explain to you the current situation. So we have this button created in the surface. It's currently turned off. Solo isn't engaged on the track and the button isn't lit on my keyboard. I'm going to press the button on my keyboard now. Okay, the lights come on my keyboard. You can see that the solo button's just been lit and solo's come on. Everything's working fine, isn't it? Let's press the button again. Nothing's changed. The light's still lit on my keyboard. Solo's still lit over here and the track is still active. In fact, however many times I press this key, this button, from that point onwards, it doesn't work. And the reason for that is that both Cubase and the keyboard are trying to control that button's operation. Only one of those 2 parties can control the button, not both of them. There's a limitation of the S49 that it can't actually surrender control of these buttons, so it demands that it has control of this functionality. This toggle feature here is me stating that the keyboard is in control of maintaining its own state. If it was capable of surrendering control to Cubase, you would have an option here called gate. That would be the way to make the keyboard a slave. Well, we can't do that, so let's not worry about it today. The keyboard's insisting that it maintains control of the button state, which means Cubase needs to surrender. And we can do that in the lower window, in the mappings window. With the buttons selected, you get some configuration options down below. And this value mode that says toggle is Cubase's attempt to impose its will on the button. And as I've just explained, we need to surrender that control. We do that by switching to jump mode instead. That means that when the keyboard says jump, Cubase will jump. It's literally a I will defer to you command. So now that Cubase isn't in control of that button state and the keyboard gets to choose its own destiny, let's try pressing this button again. Now the button's gone out and the solo state's gone out. Press it once more. That button is working perfectly. What's more, it works perfectly in both directions. Let's close the mapping assistant down and go over to Cubase. Now I'm going to press solo on Cubase. The light on my keyboard is currently lit and it's just gone out. And now it's just come back on again. It's a pity I haven't got a second camera because you'd be able to see this. But there is a direct two-way communication between these two devices. The reason that's working is this function down here, transmit to hardware. If I disable that, now Cubase won't send any instructions from itself up to the keyboard. So the light's currently lit, the light is still lit. Now I've broken that connection and Cubase doesn't get to tell the keyboard what its state is. Turn it back on, and once again the light toggles on and off. So as far as the configuration of the buttons are concerned, and once again this is entirely dependent on your hardware's limitations, if your hardware insists on managing this toggle state, ignore trigger, that's not important for today's purposes, then you must allow Cubase to surrender that control by setting value mode to jump. And of course it's exactly the same with the other two commands. Here's my mute function, I need to set that to jump as well. And here's record enable. So now all of those three, there's me pressing solo, here's me pressing mute, and here's me pressing record enable. When I look at the lights on my keyboard, they're off, off, on. Solo's off, mute's off, record enable is on. Brilliant, buttons finished. They're nice and easy. Knobs are not so easy. We're going to spend a little bit more time dealing with them because they're far more complex because they have this constantly flowing, this variable range from 0 to 127. Okay then, here's the brief. Here's the button I'm going to configure. Button number 1 on my keyboard. Page 1, button 1. Don't forget I've got a second set of page numbers. We are going to come to page 2 a little bit later. I want to map this button into the VCF frequency control, this slider on my keyboard, and I want it to be controlled via track quick controls. So I'm going to connect those three features together. The first thing to do is to create the link between the keyboard and the quick controls. I've already done a video on configuring quick controls. I'll point you in that direction. And this is actually kind of a handshake video to that one in which I did discuss the MIDI remote functionality very briefly. So I enter learn mode for track quick controls, move the control, and that's it, done. Turn learn mode off, and there's the VCF cutoff mapped. Now I need to connect my keyboard to the quick control function. Let's turn the synth off for a moment, we don't need that. Let's head back into the mapping assistant and select the button I'm interested in. This time I can search for QC. I'm configuring a track quick control. Everything's good in the pair window, click apply, and that's that function done. I might as well do 2 and 3 while I'm here. So if I sort this function list now, we can see all 8 quick controls. Here's QC1. Close the mapping assistant down. So what's our current state of play? Let's move the knob. Watch the quick control cutoff. Okay, something's wrong there. Can you see? I'm moving the knob quite vigorously and we're getting weird values, but the value is always the same. That's because I have my keyboard configured in relative offset mode. This is a bit of a thing, so let's slow down and just think about this for a moment. First of all, have a look at the knob properties. The value mode is currently set to absolute, which means whatever instruction it receives, Cubase receives from the keyboard, will be set to exactly that value. Let's have a look at the keyboard configuration. In the knobs section, the control type, it's outputting a CC. It doesn't particularly matter what the CC number is. For these quick control assignments, I have effectively a reserved range, so I don't use 14 to 21 anywhere else in my system. But Cubase doesn't particularly care what the CC number is. The important thing here is this relative offset. What this basically means is the keyboard is outputting only 2 values, 63s and 65s, and they effectively mean down and up, respectively. Every time I move this knob anti-clockwise, I'm sending a 63 into Cubase, and every time I move it clockwise, I'm sending a 65. Cubase is receiving those values and interpreting them absolutely, and so it's setting the cutoff to exactly 63 or 65. If I set it into relative, binary offset is the option you want. Don't worry about the others for today. There's so many different rabbit holes we could jump down here. binary offset is far and away the most common option you're going to choose if you're using offset values. So now when Cubase receives those 63s and 65s, here we go, anti-clockwise first. There's the cutoff going down, and now clockwise. There's the cutoff going back up again. So Cubase is simply receiving ups and downs now, and it's responding properly to those instructions. So if I put this synthesizer in automation mode and press play, there's my automation being written. Working perfectly well. Furthermore, because I'm in relative offset mode, it means I never get big jumps in automation. In order to demonstrate that, I'll actually configure it in absolute mode as well, which is an option for you. You can do it. So I'll show you how that works and then explain why I don't do it this way. So I've switched value mode to absolute in the knob property, but I have to make that change in my keyboard configuration as well. It's essential that both parties to this contract speak the same language. So now that we're in absolute mode, let's get rid of all that automation and start again. Okay, what looks like it's working perfectly well. Got automation being written there. There are two problems with what we've just done, and this is basically we're going to get to the stage where I'm explaining why I don't use absolute mode. In order to get there, we need to go through this function first, the transmit to hardware. Remember I said this is where Cubase sends that instruction back to the controller. When you're dealing with variable automation like we have here, this function can get in the way. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the song again and zoom in pretty tight. Now then, when I start writing automation, can you see I'm trying to write smooth. I'm basically turning the knob very smoothly, but we're getting these steps. See how zigzag that is? That's because Cubase is sending instructions back to the keyboard, which is overwriting the keyboard's current state, and it's basically jumping backwards and forwards. So this transmit function is getting in the way. This only causes a problem when you're in absolute mode, because Cubase is sending an absolute value back to the keyboard. That value is out of date by that point because I've already moved the controller somewhere else. I'm moving it continuously in an analog fashion. And what you're seeing here is the argument between the digital instructions from Cubase and the analog movements of my hand. So absolute plus transmit to hardware don't work. If I disable transmit to hardware, absolute works absolutely fine. Excuse the pun. Now I'm drawing beautifully smooth automation curves and everything's working perfectly happily. The problem is I've just disabled a function that I want. I want it to transmit its values to the keyboard, because when I look at the keyboard, I want to see what the current state is. I have a display on my keyboard that tells me what the current state of that function is. If I turn off this transmit to hardware and I do any sort of manual operation in Cubase, I've broken that link. So transmit to hardware is great. I don't get to use it if I'm in absolute mode. I do get to use it if I'm in binary offset mode, because now all Cubase is doing is outputting its current value to the keyboard, so that when I take my hand off the knob, the number's correct. Cubase is outputting that number properly to the keyboard. The moment I take physical control of that knob and turn it again, all I'm doing is sending ups and downs into Cubase. So those two communication streams don't clash, don't collide. So this combination of options works perfectly for automation. I was just about to do another test then, but obviously I need to set my keyboard back to relative mode. That's how they're supposed to work, as far as I'm concerned. And now there's me writing my automation again. Beautifully smooth. And the moment I let go and stop the song and look at my keyboard, value 44 is the current state. That's the last instruction that it received from Cubase. The next thing I want to have a look at is the old world MIDI CC view of things, because MIDI CC kind of collapses when you try to integrate it into the MIDI remote. It really doesn't work very well at all. The way that I'm going to demonstrate this is to use resonance instead. So we're going to use the next control along on my filter. And what I'm going to do is configure the resonance control using the old MIDI learn functionality. To do this, I'm going to use the second page of controls on my keyboard. Let's have a look at them. These are configured for old world MIDI CC use. So the knobs are outputting CC values 22 to 29. But can you see that this time they're in absolute mode? Absolute is the simplest, the more crude of the MIDI CC communication protocols. If you're using MIDI CC, it's probably because you're using an old plugin or maybe some hardware that really doesn't have those options to be able to set it into relative. So I'm dealing with absolute simplest case scenario here. So this is the knob we're interested in, which as you can see is set to 22 absolute mode. Now I need to tab away from the MIDI remote. If I leave this engaged, it's going to intercept the MIDI commands that I'm trying to send into this keyboard. So I actually need to close it down, put my keyboard in learn mode, select the function that I want to map, and then move the knob. And there's CC22 assigned to resonance. So let's create some automation. Get the track running again and move the knob. And here you can see there's me creating resonance automation. Let's have a look at this automation lane. Hover over it, MIDI CC22, exactly as expected. Now I'm going to show you why track quit controls are so superior to the old world MIDI CC. I'm going to go back to the beginning. Here's bar 2. I'm going to get the song running again, but this time I'm going to move the resonance knob on the interface. It's really hard for me to do. I've picked it up and I'm moving it. You can see me wiggling it backwards and forwards, but it's been created on a different automation lane. This plugin is inherently automation enabled. Every function in it is intrinsically mapped into the automation engine in Cubase. The moment I picked up that control, it doesn't care that I've manually configured it for MIDI CC22. It's overriding the value, and now we've got two different lanes competing with each other. This does not happen with quick controls. If I go back to page 1 again, while I've got this editor open, I can't actually press any of the buttons on my keyboard. It basically shuts the keyboard down. I have to do everything manually. So I'm going back to page 1 now in order to re-enable my quick controls. Get the song running. Here's me manipulating the automation on the filter lane. You can see at the top. So that's me moving the knob on my physical keyboard. Go back to the beginning. Now I'm going to pick up that control from inside the interface, and it's the same control. The automation is perfectly and completely seamless between the track quit controls, the GUI, the physical hardware, Cubase. Everything is talking the same language and it all works perfectly. If you try to do that job with MIDI CC, you have the potential for this kind of conflict where you get two different communication streams disagreeing with each other. You might also be wondering why I have these page 2 controls set up in absolute mode when I've already expressed a preference for using relative offsets. Well, for MIDI CC, it's very common for plugins to simply not be able to speak relative language. As far as this Arturia synthesizer is concerned, actually it can. I can configure, if I right click on this MIDI mapping, I can configure it to be in relative mode, and then I'll be able to change this value. But other synthesizers, Omnisphere for example, doesn't have a relative option. It can only output absolute messages, and so you can't configure generic CC controls that are designed to work with anything. You can't safely configure them in relative mode because so many plugins simply don't speak that language. So my recommendation is don't even bother. In fact, my superset recommendation is just abandon MIDI CC entirely. As far as the MIDI remote control editor is concerned, it's really not bringing anything to the party. Where the power of MIDI remote lies is in the integration with Cubase functions, and that's really got nothing to do with MIDI CC. It's a different process, it's a different communication protocol. And with that said, we're done. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.